20.
Okay, we're going to spend 3 weeks looking at the second letter of Paul to the Church of the Corinthians. And if you didn't get a map yet, make sure you get a map, a two-sided map. If you've got your Bibles, this is the time to take them out. If you don't, you can find one on your smartphone. Or 20 different ones on your smartphone.
And if you could look at the picture of the Bible.
I got this one.
And just, there's one map that has a broader view of the eastern Mediterranean area. And I think that's got some missionary roots for Paul. And then there's one that's closer up that will zero in on the city of Corinth, along the isthmus of the same name. It's about 4 miles wide there, and has always been a strategic place for getting merchandise more quickly through Greece instead of going all the way around Sparta. And remember, in these days, people just didn't set out and generally go directly across the Mediterranean Sea. They were afraid of it for good reasons. Storms could come up. The Apostle Paul was always getting shipwrecked, it seemed, or at least talking about it. And they did 2 things eventually. One was to build a canal, the other was to build a sort of a ramp across which they could drag ships from one side to another. So it became, the city was one of those distribution points that could collect a fee for having ships go over the isthmus, and got some of its revenue that way, but also it was, being a sea town, it was very prominent for merchants and for trade. And like any city, any port city, you could probably have heard the words, "Are you new in town, sailor?" And all of the business and commerce that goes with that. And if you remember some of the parts of the first letter to the Corinthians, you'll know that some of those things were on Paul's mind. They were also on the mind of the Corinthians. We have to remember, it's fairly clear from that first letter, as we have it in our scriptures, that there were letters from the Corinthians. Sadly, we don't have those. It would make things much more interesting to find out who was telling tales on who else in the church.
Were the letters from the Corinthians sent to Paul?
I'm sorry?
Were the letters from the Corinthians sent to Paul?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he was recognized by a fair amount of the church as a person who could arbitrate on their behalf. Not quite like a bishop, but perhaps one of the bishop's canons who was running interference for the bishop. So it's a much more, you don't always write Bishop Mary Ann if you want to tattle on your congregation. You might want to write an email to the canon for the ordinary, or the canon for placement. There are all sorts of canons you could write to if you couldn't get the bishop's attention. And of course, we're sort of pre-bishop. We've still got apostles, and even the whole concept of apostle is still something that's a bit fluid here, although taking on a technical meaning, because Paul is very self-conscious about that title. And we'll see that also as we move through 2 Corinthians. The other thing is that it seems to be the case that 1 Corinthians is perhaps a composite of 2 letters. And then there's a third letter that we don't have, and we'll find reference to that very quickly. And that the second letter, as it is in the canon, may be the fourth and the fifth letters. So there was a fair amount of correspondence in a day when you didn't have a modern post office, but you'd have to either send somebody with a letter or pay somebody to make the trip. And while it doesn't seem to be like large distances, remember we're on foot or we're on a horse or a donkey or something, and things don't get quite where they're going to. I mean, there were some amount of actual official post offices, probably not the word, postal services, because I believe it was Hadewijch who told us about that neither rain or snow and all of that will keep the whatever from its appointed rounds. I can't quite get the exact quote, but that goes back a lot of years, and as empires were established and a certain amount of peaceful commerce was then allowed over long distances, you get some established routes over which letters of this sort would be sent. But Paul is usually entrusting one of his faithful companions to this duty.
And it would have been hard, I mean, for them to figure out where he was, because he was moving around most of this time. And so I wonder sometimes if that post wouldn't have taken place through someone from Corinth who says, I'm traveling and I expect to see him in such and such a place or whatever. But
that's an excellent question, because he did move around, and we'll even see in the opening parts of this letter, canonical letter, that he had been in 2 or 3 different places very quickly, and I suppose if the letter were coming from Corinth, they'd get to one spot, well, we heard Paul was here, and they got there and said, well, he was here last week, but he was going to Macedonia, and then they run to Macedonia, and well, he was here last week, but now he's headed back in some other direction. So yeah,
so maybe the letter was really beat up when it got there, and that's why it didn't last, right? And we don't.
I'm sorry,
So maybe the letter from the Corinthians was so well worn by the time it got to Paul, it fell apart, and that's why we don't have those letters.
something. Well, it was, you know, one gets the sense that it was, you know, dear Paul, did you know that so-and-so was making trouble? Did you know that so-and-so said this and that and the other thing? And did you know that Apollos said, and did you know that?
Yeah, right.
I mean, they were probably borderline gossipy. That's just a guess on my part, but I'm suspecting that the letters from Corinth were more about personal issues than they were about theological issues. Except where you get people competing. We see this a lot in the first letter. People competing to show they have the gifts of the Spirit. That's why we get 1 Corinthians 13, well, 12 and 13.
Yeah.
In 12, there's this whole list of spirits, and then it's sort of, but I'm going to tell you something better than that. And then we get the famous letter, or the famous 13th chapter. So that was in part reacting to people who thought they were better because they had this or that spirit, this or that gift of the Spirit that was manifest. So I'm also making a couple of Christological assumptions which will come in later in the 3 weeks. And the first is that the incarnate Jesus had a body. The second is that the risen Jesus had a body. It didn't function in the same way. But we've heard these rather scandalous accounts that Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, was eating. What's that all about? He seemed to be able to go through locked doors, but then he would sit down and eat. So and he'd appear and disappear. So there's a concept of body there that these people had that they put Jesus into, and we have to put that together with what Paul says about bodies. And we get a lot of that. We've had it in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about the body that gets raised, but it's not the body that was quote-unquote planted, but it's something new. It's a spiritual body instead of a psychic body. And I'm saying psychic instead of physical because in the Greek it says psychike, that is of the soul. And those differences are important. Paul was not always exact in his use of Greek terminology, which drives scholars over the edge sometimes. But because he would use terms that have been used since Plato before, but then you'd want to sit down and ask, and you can't do that. Well, what exactly are you talking about when you say body, soma, or flesh, sarx, or what are you talking about, nous, mind, pneuma, spirit, or if you use a word for heart, or even better, if we use the word for heart in English and we can't find it in the Greek, which adds to complications. Or that we're apt to say in worship, body, mind, and spirit. Well, mind and spirit would pretty much have been the same thing, nous and pneuma. There's not a lot of that. And then you can toss in, well, where's the image of God? Because Paul also uses that term, and we also have the community as the body of Christ. So we have this body thing is going on and on with some philosophical understandings, but also understandings in terms of what Christians believed Christ's body to have been and had become. And then we remember it's only been 20 years since Jesus walked the earth. So we can't expect to develop systematic theology from Paul. Now, that probably should have been the first thing I said. And the second thing is, although Paul is often given credit for or blamed for inventing the church, he did no such thing. I'll say that clearly. He wasn't expecting this current earth to be around very long. So any expectation that he had for the future was very, very short. If you had told him that there would be this church 2,000 years after he was preaching the gospel of Christ, he would have looked at you funny and said, oh, no. Jesus isn't going to take that long to come back. And that's also true for Jesus. He didn't, when he talks about the kingdom, it's imminent. And then, of course, the theology and the ecclesiology have to be redone after things don't end. But also we remember that there already was a community there. The word that we get that's used in Greek for what we call church is ecclesia, and ecclesia is already in the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible for the community. Paul, of course, we'll see it, especially in 2 Corinthians, is talking about this new community that's taken over in place of the old community. And he says it in very stark words in 2 Corinthians. But also in other places, he's not quite so sure that his judgment, actually he's quite sure that it's not his judgment, but God's judgment about who will be saved, specifically in the context of the Jews. God saves whom God will. Okay, this letter starts out with Paul, and feel free to interrupt me. Paul, an apostle. So he's immediately using that title he uses in his letters as a word of authority. Not quite technical, but pretty close to technical by this time. We're about the year 55. Still just a generation after the earthly life of Jesus. So it's early. It's early, but we have that designation. Somebody's borrowed one of my books, and I guess I'm going to have to get another copy. We often think of apostles as just men, but this book makes a good case that Junia, Juni, despite some attempts to make the Greek text look like she was a man, was actually not a man but a woman, but still called an apostle. Junia, Junia. There's a nice little book that's one of the best books I've ever read about such a topic because it's so systematic. And Paul knows Junia, so it's not as though Paul didn't have this in mind. Yes?
So I'll interrupt now, by the way. Make the distinction between an apostle and a disciple. Just for clarity.
Disciple is a much more general word and doesn't come to have the technical meaning.
What's the technical meaning? I said, you said it doesn't come to have the technical meaning. What's the technical meaning then of apostle? What's more technical about it?
Well, that's the question here is whether an apostle is someone, in Paul's mind at least, someone who has to have seen Jesus.
That's right.
Someone who what?
Who saw
But Paul
Jesus.
argues for a wider meaning in terms of his own ministry. I mean, he has this experience of the risen Christ. Christ saying, Paul, why do you persecute me? Or, I'm sorry, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he's, as I say, trying to widen that. And other people are called apostles in the scriptures. And we come to recognize that. Now, the Orthodox Church has another category sort of in between, and that's equal to the apostles, which means not quite equal to the apostles.
Like Apostle Minor, Apostle Major.
Apostle light.
Mary Magdalene is equal to the apostles
Right, yeah.
in the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church has none of this scuttlebutt started, well, enhanced by Pope Gregory I. She's much more honored in the Orthodox Church. A lot of the missionaries to various places are called equal to the apostles. So that also broadens the sense of what an apostle could be. Paul is writing this letter with Timothy, called his brother, and that was a brother in the faith. There's no reason to believe that Timothy was, certainly he wasn't his own brother. And one of the interesting things about Timothy is that he's said to be from a Christian family. His mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois were both Christians. And to have a third generation Christian family in the year 55 is pretty early indeed. So they must have been early converts as the missionaries spread out from Jerusalem around the eastern Mediterranean. And he pops up in a lot of different places, and he gets his own Acts. All the apostles, he's called apostle as well, have Acts which are more or less fantastic and full of all sorts of details that are pretty shady. And a lot of them are written long after their time, but one of, I suppose, what I call the rules of church history is that it abhors a vacuum. So everybody who should have something written about them has something written about them. And if they don't have a name, they get a name. This is one of the great things about Google now. You can just, if you need a name for somebody in a text you're preaching on and that person isn't named, you just Google up. And, you can't call Bruce Metzger anymore, but he was a prominent Princeton theologian, Bible scholar who knew all these things and wrote articles about them. But you can Google up, say, the Syrophoenician woman and her daughter, whose names I've forgotten. I think Veronique is the daughter's name in church history. So there's a sense that everything gets filled in. Lot's wife, and Noah's wife, and everybody else's wife that didn't get a name. They've all got names in the tradition.
Paul, where was Junia from before we get too far from that conversation? Is she Corinthian?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I forgot right now.
Okay. I can look it up on Google.
You look her up. Yes.
Didn't Paul himself travel with a woman upon occasion, a woman minister? I think he calls her a minister of kind.
Well, that depends on whether or not you believe the Thecla stories.
What stories?
Thecla.
Oh, I thought that's what you said. Okay.
Yeah, Thecla. Ooh.
Thecla was an early Christian martyr.
Thecla is one of those characters about whom a lot is written, and a lot of it's pretty early. She is recognized by the Orthodox Church as equal to the apostles. But in a lot of the tradition, she disappears. And a lot of what's written about her is rather fantastic.
She's mentioned, Egeria mentions her. She visited one of her monasteries. I'm just beginning to read the diaries. And there's also a little tableau of Thecla at the Franciscan monastery.
Yeah. Well, she's given a very prominent place in history. Scripturally, there's not much to, I don't think there's anything. Yes.
What was on that topic, isn't it, do you accept the theory that somebody, maybe a whole host of a team, went in and removed any reference to women in the epistles?
Well, they didn't do a good job because there's still women mentioned.
There are
still
plenty of
Phoebe
women.
and
Not
Junia
enough.
and
There probably were more.
Priscilla. I
Yeah.
mean, they certainly weren't all excised, and I don't. As to whether there was a conspiracy, I have no idea.
Can I borrow
I mean, that's
I have a friend who wrote a book, and if I can look it up on Google, I can give you the name of it, Chris Schenk.
okay.
And she wrote a book, if you could just even type in Chris Schenk, S-C-H-E-N-K. And the book is about women in the Bible, and it has just come out. I have it at home, but I've not read it yet. And she's got pictures of all kinds of places where Paul traveled, where women are depicted. And she's researched who these women are. And it's really pretty interesting, actually.
You've also got Lydia.
Oh, there's tons of it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's lots who remain in the scriptures.
And if we can't find the name, let's see.
Did I spell it?
Yes. All right, but I need to check it. Let's see if I can find the name of the book. it's got a lot of stuff.
Now, we find out also early on that the letter that we don't have to the Corinthians was a rather sharply worded letter. He refers both to a painful visit, which seems to happen after what we have in 1 Corinthians, before 2 Corinthians, but there was a visit and a letter which Paul refers to as painful. And we don't really get the details of that either, which is unfortunate because that would help us fill in details. He assumes the hearers, and because they would have heard it and not read it so much, but the hearers of the letters he's writing that we're looking at now wouldn't know what he's referring to. Just like Egeria, when she wrote about the liturgies, she would, every once in a while, you'd come to this, and then everything else looks like what we have in Spain. And then you want to shake her and say, yeah, but we don't know what you were doing in Spain, so why didn't you tell us? And we would have had a broader understanding of what liturgy was in the last of the 4th century. And she just told us what was different. And that's what we're often left with, those lacunae in the text where it's assumed that the people, the audience for the text, knows what's going on. And here we are 2,000 years later, and we say, well, what was that about? But there are places in 1 Corinthians where you could assume that Paul got rather direct in his accusations about people. I mean, there are a lot of things going on, particularly, I think, in 2 major areas. Sort of a sense of what's unclean and clean, and whether you could lord it over people because you knew that sacrificial meat wasn't affected at all by the sacrifices. But there were some people who understood that to be something you shouldn't consume. And that was a big issue. And then another issue was what I've referred to before in terms of the gifts of the Spirit. And I think Paul would have spoken to that very sharply about people in the community arranging a sort of hierarchy of the gifts of the Spirit. And people who thought that they were, pillars of the community because they could speak in tongues. Well, he would, as he always pointed out, if it might be okay, as it were, for your personal prayer, but in the community it doesn't do anybody any good unless it's interpreted. And that's
that makes sense.
something I think that needs always to be pointed out. I mean, that's...
Could God understand?
Well, yes, God understands it,
They were talking to their God.
but
He speaks all languages.
but then didn't you have to ask yourself, what communication is there in communal worship among the congregants? And for Paul, just speaking in tongues in the midst of the community was showing off.
But they do that in the one religion today,
Oh yeah, you can find a lot of denominations where if you aren't speaking in tongues and you really aren't up to the criteria of the community. So yeah, that is an issue. 2,000 years later, it's still an issue.
My dad always said, well, that's about mine. That's what my dad said.
What was that?
Sanctified church, that's about mine.
Oh, I see. If you went to the sanctified church,
Yeah.
and it would mess up
They
your mind.
talked in tongues.
Ah,
Yeah. But they were fine people. I know that much.
okay.
But they were his God.
So did you have church dates?
They had church days every month. son did.
But I mean, did you?
Oh, me, did I? No, my dad was with it. I was opposing another girl with this guy, and I told my dad I had to put in 15 minutes, and I was on his church ground, and I saw it. As long as I didn't go in the house, I was okay, I could go to the ground.
Oh, okay. There were rules to be applied.
Yeah, as long as you did his rules, he was with his dad, he would do whatever you want to do. But he had to stop homeless.
Okay. So you never got in a service where they were speaking in
You know,
tongues?
went in the church.
I'm
I
sorry?
did not go in the church.
You didn't go into the
I
church?
go to the ground.
You could go to the church grounds with your boyfriend, but not into the church.
So I didn't even talk to him on the ground. I
Okay.
just saw it.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. We should also note that it wasn't just Corinth, but it was to all the saints in Achaia. And if you look at the maps, Achaia is on the map, and it's a much wider area of Greece. So he's both got a wide concept of who the saints are, who the holy people are, and he also recognizes that these things that he is writing will be shared. Remember, at this time we had no Gospels, no Acts of the Apostles. Nobody else had written a letter that, the canonical ones are later. But what he has probably come to understand is that the community in Corinth or among the Thessalonians and Galatians, they looked at these letters and they said, well, this is pretty good advice for everybody. So they would have shared parts of them probably and said, well, you know, this is what Paul said to us, but you have a similar issue in your community. So here's a part of the letter that Paul sent to us. And that way was one of the ways that Paul's letters got distributed before they became, as it were, canonical. You know, the Christian Testament canonical issues are really later, much later than what we're talking about here. Although these are canonical to all the churches. I know I often ask, you know, when did the Christian community settle on a consensus canon? And the answer is they haven't yet. Partly because of the Hebrew scripture and what's accepted in some churches. The Ethiopian canon goes way farther than we do in books, including the marvelous book of Enoch, or Enoch, in which you get a lot of extra angels and archangels to talk about. So, okay.
I found the title of the
Oh,
book that
yeah,
my friend
okay.
wrote. It's Crispina and Her Sisters, Women and Authority in Early Christianity. And it's got lots of pictures of the women as they're depicted historically. Do you know who
Crispina?
is? I haven't read it, so I don't know that, but that was somebody she had studied.
Do a forum.
Pardon me?
Do a forum after you read it.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a good
You're gonna
idea.
make me read this,
That's
aren't
a
you?
very good idea.
Yep.
I was going to offer it to anybody who would like it. I'll bring it next week and you can do the reading.
But you can do the forum.
Okay, I will look at it, yes.
Yeah, certainly the tradition is not devoid of women. I mean, that's an overstatement.
Can you
of what the-
repeat that, Paul? What did you s- Can you
I'm
repeat?
sorry?
Can you just repeat what you said? The traditions are not, or are they?
I mean, women, the tradition is not devoid of women. I mean, the history of the church includes a lot of women.
That's right.
And
But
one
they
of
were
the
not
things-
acknowledged. They were not acknowledged.
Oh, a lot of them were.
Yeah, up until a certain
I mean,
point,
if
until
you-
you got into the Catholic
If-
Church in the 6th century.
If you read the hagiography of the church, churches, you'll find just hundreds of them. mean, part of the problem, if you cut off the development of the church at Constantine and don't pick it up again until the Reformation or afterwards, you miss a lot of that. We're going to talk about some of those women in the third session. You miss a lot of the contribution of women to the church.
Even before the church, Mary Magdalene was an apostle, wasn't she?
Yeah, well,
She's the first apostle.
I think you hadn't quite arrived when I said that the Orthodox Church calls her equal to the apostles,
Great.
or apostle to the apostles.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize for being late.
That's okay.
I went to bed too late, but I'm glad I didn't miss it. And Paul,
I'm happy to repeat.
no, you don't have to. But I'm here because I have to restore my. I used to love Paul, and then I learned about him and his issues against women and all of the above, and then he kind of went down in the totem pole, so to say. But I'm here to learn more about him, and I'm glad. But I just have this, maybe it's a prejudice about him and his issue against women. I'm here to learn, and I'm glad I didn't miss it all.
What's fascinating, that I referred to a book about the Apostle Junia, who sometimes has been made into a man. And actually, the attempts to make her into a man are 19th century.
Oh,
Wow,
right,
already, okay.
So
Okay.
you remember
Makes
that the
sense.
status of women fell at the Reformation. Fell.
Yep.
Because the women's monasteries were wiped out.
Wow.
And those abbesses, when you look at the picture of the
That's
abbesses,
Germany? No,
they're
where was
carrying, what are they carrying?
Crozier.
A crozier. What's a crozier?
The sign of the bishop.
Sign of the bishop.
That's right.
They're pretty serious
Was that
about it.
Germany, or where was it?
All
over
over.
Europe.
Yeah. In fact, you think of Orthodox monasticism as sort of cloistering its women, but Isaiah and I were at a liturgy for St. Nina, who herself is called equal to the apostles. And though the abbess of the monastery's staff wasn't quite as elaborate as the bishop, she had a staff, and for the liturgy she was dressed in a purple robe that looked exactly like what the bishop had on during the mass, during the sort of morning prayer before the liturgy. And I'll tell you, she looked like a person of authority.
So she was in a position of presiding.
She did not, well,
Junia, are you talking about?
No, this is sorry.
oh no,
Already in the
this is in January.
No, he visited a monastery.
But the croziers, the women abbesses, had this power throughout history. But when Protestantism did in monasticism, one of the things they took with them was an alternate source of authority for women.
Yeah, it's an alternate place for them to actually spend their lives as well.
Yeah,
You could even be married and going to the convent.
yeah. I mean, after that, you just get married, and that's.
But Catholicism, so to say, have done it before, or did it afterwards?
I'm sorry.
Catholicism, the Catholic Church, have done kind of a, especially in the hierarchy, that women are not going nowhere. Has that been an issue forever with the Catholic Church that you know of before Protestantism?
Women had more authority than in a lot of Catholic history than they did ever in Protestantism
How about
until
that?
recently. I mean, that's one of the Protestant fallacies.
Think of all the saints.
All the saints,
Yeah.
all the
female
abbesses.
saints.
Hilda Whitby in the
Right.
6th century,
That's right.
she actually oversaw also the men's monastery. It was a double monastery at Whitby, and she was the boss also of the men's monastery.
Huh.
So be careful what Protestants tell you about the Catholic Church.
Okay.
Yes.
I want to get into
like she said, she probably had a problem with Paul, and a lot of women I've talked to concerning the scriptures that he had in Corinthians and Ephesians. I think the one that most, I would have to say, I can't speak for women, but I think most women have a problem with is the women should keep silence in the church and not to usurp authority over a man, for it was Eve who was deceived and not Adam. And some of them.
Darren,
Right.
Darren, he said that they had to stay silent unless they cut their hair.
Okay, all right.
So
Okay.
which letter was that of Paul's?
1 Corinthians.
Yes.
Your first.
Okay.
But, again, in that book about Junia the Apostle,
Okay.
there's a fascinating chapter that casts an awful lot of doubt on whether or not Paul wrote that.
Correct.
Even to the manuscript tradition, in at least one of the old manuscripts, there are some dots that you can still see, I think, under texts that are thought to be spurious. And not just, I think, in 1 Corinthians, but in other texts as well. And some of those, that very text about women being silent is marked.
The thing I want to bring up though, but in the Old Testament, God used women to do, just marvelous works and to lead, Israel, and, he used Hannah, he used Esther, he used Deborah, he used all of these people, these beautiful women to make points, to make marks in history that changed the course of Israel.
Yes.
So
I have actually heard sermons about how this indicated how far Israel had fallen, that it had to be led by a woman.
that's ridiculous. And then if Jesus refers to the church as the bride,
Yes.
I think that speaks volumes.
Yes.
And, as far as, of course there's no male nor female in Christ, but at the same time, if he refers to it as the church.
Right. We have contradictions in Paul, but we also have, don't forget Mary.
Yeah.
She was married.
Forget Mary. One of my favorite icons was in an Ethiopian restaurant in Boston, where the E line takes a broad turn toward Jamaica Plain. It's at the wedding of Cana. And there's a little conflict in there between Jesus and his mother. She says, Jesus, they're out of wine. Sort of parentheses, what are you going to do about it? And in this icon, there are several tables of guests. And Mary and Jesus are away from the tables, and they're pointing fingers at each other. It's a remarkable visual text of that. And Jesus spoke back and said, "Well, what are you talking about? Who are you, woman?" And then she just goes off and said, "Well, you just follow what he says." And there's a sense that she moved up the messianic agenda at that point. It's an extraordinary,
The first
She
miracle.
intervened.
The first miracle.
She intervened.
she it was sort of like, well, yeah, so what? And what are you telling me this for?
Right.
Who am I to do this? And then she says, do what he says.
That's lovely.
But I've always got the sense that Jesus wasn't quite ready, as he's portrayed in the 2nd chapter of John. But Mary knew it was time.
Wow.
Oh, God.
And this icon is perfectly expresses that.
Beautiful.
Because Mary is not backing down in this icon. She's no meek and mild mother of God. like you find in some of the 19th century treckle that passes for Marian hymns. Or the K Street, you'll hear some of these. But she was right there to push her son. I think here.
Yeah. I was going to say, what did you want us to hear today? And do you want us to read something for next week?
You could read the whole letter. It's not that long.
Okay.
Make sure you read it. Just a couple of things that I wanted, a couple of
Second
words.
letter, right, Paul? The second letter to Corinthians?
Second letter of
Okay,
Corinthians.
got
Yeah, read the whole thing.
Okay.
It'll take you 15 minutes. Then you can read it again. And then you can learn Greek and read it for a third time. Okay, we've got the pain, we've got the visit, we've got Paul moving around because he couldn't find people either, which is quite fantastic. Then we get the comments by the Jews, but there was, let's see, where he calls God the Father of mercies, right early on in the opening segment here, chapter 1, verse 3. And the sense of, we should always remember when the scriptures, especially Greek-written scriptures, talk about compassion and mercy, that it's not some sort of abstract, mental, spiritual thing. It's right here. The seat of compassion for the Greeks was in the bowels, in the guts. So when in the Gospels, when Jesus is described as taking compassion or having compassion on someone, the verb in Greek contains the word for bowels, guts. He felt it in his guts.
You say the word that was Greek for vowels? What was it?
Splanknos is the word in Greek. And you obviously can make a verb out of anything. In most any language. I know the copy editors don't like that, but it's too late. Shakespeare can make a verb out of just anything.
You see that same compassion in people?
Yeah, I mean, you often when you have sympathy or feel compassion, you feel it here. You know what that is. And so Jesus wasn't just this ethereal thing. He had a body and it reacted like a human body, reacted like our bodies. And so even here where it's talking about God the Father, it's a Father of mercies, but it's that sort of getting involved in humanity and its bodies kind of mercy. It's not abstract. Let's not abstract this too much. And one of the other words, just because I think it's a marvelous word, 2nd chapter, verse 14. In the New Revised Standard Version, it says triumphal procession, which is pretty good. But I want to leave you with two images as to what sort of triumphal procession that this verb indicates. Have you all seen the 10 Commandments?
Yeah.
Of course.
How many times? 50 times. Fairly early in the movie, they come back with the spoils of war, and there are all those quote-unquote Nubians in their native whatevers, and they're dancing. That's what Paul was talking about.
Triumphal procession.
Triumphal procession.
Okay.
Just over the top. This is not just a
stage sort of.
stage parade. The other image, the movie Cleopatra, when Cleopatra comes in on this big thing, drawn by slaves, Elizabeth Taylor, of course. Of course. That type of triumphal procession, which the Romans were very good at.
Very British.
Circuses.
And the British.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. The British are just very good at it. But that's the sort of triumphal procession that Paul is talking about, which, when he talks about the humility of Christ, his own humility, his weakness, and yet then he throws in this idea of a over-the-top, gobsmacking, extraordinary procession. There's something perhaps about Christ the King in there, the triumphant Christ, the resurrected Christ, that really does take it up a notch. So it's not just any parade.
So Paul, when we read the second letter, do you want us to look for certain images or?
Images, yeah.
Okay.
What
touches
comes
our
to your
hearts?
mind?
Okay.
Yeah.
What follows after the triumphant procession, that God uses us to spread the aroma
That's right, yeah. Were you here for Martin Smith's?
of the knowledge of Him everywhere. Do you see that phrase right after? After the triumphant procession. Isn't
Yeah.
that amazing?
And through us spreads in every place the fragrance that comes from knowing Him.
It's aroma.
So we're God's incense.
That's right.
You bet.
That's right.
That's beautiful.
We're supposed to be God's
That's poetry.
Yeah, I mean, let's all process in the cathedral we've got and smoke it up.
Well, is it true that people of intense holiness actually have a very sweet aroma, physically sweet aroma?
The Orthodox would tell you that.
Yes.
And all those saints who didn't deteriorate in their graves either.
Right.
No, while they were alive, Paul. It was sweet
Okay,
fragrance
we'll
of
do this
holiness.
next
I
week.
haven't made it yet, have you?
We're going to focus after a fashion on chapter 12.
Chapter 12. Get
Yeah,
that?
so read chapter 12 about 10 times.
Yeah.
Second. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.